There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a room when a duke walks in. It is not the comfortable silence of a peaceful evening, nor the reverent hush of a church. It is something sharper, a held breath, a frozen moment. The silence of every mother in England, calculating the distance between her unmarried daughter and the most powerful man in the room. On the evening of the 14th of October, 1814, that silence fell over Whitmore Hall like a velvet curtain dropping on a stage. The Duke of Ashford had arrived, and every mother in Derbyshire intended to make the most of it. Lady Cecilia Voss had not wanted to come to the autumn ball. She had said so 3 times, once at breakfast, once while her maid was lacing her corset so tightly she could barely draw breath, and once more on the carriage steps, when she had paused and looked back at the warm amber light spilling from the windows of their townhouse with something very close to longing. Her mother had not listened to any of it. "You will smile," Lady Voss had said, adjusting Cecilia's gloves with the brisk efficiency of a general preparing troops for battle. "You will be pleasant, you will not say anything peculiar, and for the love of all that is holy, you will not argue with anyone about the Corn Laws." "I only mentioned the Corn Laws once," Cecilia said. "You mentioned them to Lord Hertwick's eldest son on the occasion of your introduction. He seemed interested. He seemed terrified." Lady Voss had stepped back, examined her younger daughter with the critical eye of a woman who had staked a considerable portion of her hopes on this evening, and sighed. "You are pretty enough when you make the effort, Cecilia. Tonight, make the effort." Cecilia had said nothing to that. She had simply taken her mother's arm and stepped into the carriage, settling into the corner seat beside her sister Arabella, who smelled of expensive French perfume and occupied 3 times more space than was strictly necessary. Arabella Voss was, by universal agreement, the most beautiful girl in Derbyshire. She had their mother's golden hair and their late father's blue eyes, a combination that had been causing men to walk into door frames since she was 17. She was also, by Cecilia's private assessment, profoundly and completely aware of this fact. "Do sit up straight, Cece," Arabella said without looking at her. "You look like you're trying to disappear into the upholstery." "I'm considering it," Cecilia replied. The ball at Whitmore Hall was the most significant social event of the autumn season, hosted by Lord and Lady Pemberton in honour of their daughter's engagement. Half of Derbyshire had been invited, the other half had been pointedly excluded, which was, Cecilia suspected, entirely the point. She had attended enough of these evenings to know exactly how they would unfold. The same faces, the same music, the same conversations repeated with minor variations, like a piece of sheet music played in different keys. The unmarried young men would be steered toward the unmarried young women by their respective mothers, and everyone would pretend that this manoeuvring was not happening, while it very obviously was. What Cecilia had not anticipated was the Duke of Ashford. She had heard of him, of course. Everyone had heard of Nathaniel Blackwood, the 8th Duke of Ashford. He was 32 years old, possessed of one of the largest fortunes in England, and had not attended a single social event in the 3 years since his father's death. The rumours about him varied wildly, depending on who was telling them. He was cold. He was brilliant. He had been deeply in love once, and the woman had died. He had no interest in society. He had no interest in marriage. He was impossible to impress. He was, in short, exactly the sort of man that Lady Voss had been dreaming of for Arabella since the day Arabella turned 16. Cecilia first noticed him from across the ballroom, which was no great feat. He was taller than almost everyone present, with dark hair and the kind of face that seemed to have been carved rather than grown, all clean angles and deliberate lines. He stood near the far window with a glass of wine he had not touched, watching the room with an expression of polite, impenetrable boredom. She noticed him, And then, because she had not come here to stare at dukes, she looked away. She found herself a quiet corner near the refreshments. She was very good at finding quiet corners. And settled in to watch the evening unfold with the detached interest of an observer at a play. The dancing had begun. Arabella was already in the centre of it, golden and radiant and utterly in her element. Lady Voss hovered at the edge of the floor, directing operations with the focused intensity of a woman who had been planning this campaign for years. "You look," said a voice beside her, "as though you would rather be anywhere else on earth." Cecilia turned. The Duke of Ashford was standing 2 feet away from her, still holding his untouched glass of wine. Up close, he was even more striking than he had appeared from across the room, but it was his eyes that caught her attention. They were a pale, clear grey, and they were looking at her with an expression she did not expect. Genuine curiosity. She considered denying it, considered producing the pleasant smile her mother had requested, saying something perfectly agreeable, and retreating into the comfortable fiction that she was enjoying herself enormously. Instead, she said, "I was thinking the same thing about you." A pause. Something shifted in his expression. A slight softening, almost too quick to catch. Was it that obvious? Only to someone who was doing the same thing. She glanced at his wine. "You haven't touched that. The Pemberton cellar is catastrophically overrated." He set the glass down on the nearby table with the decisive finality of a man who had made up his mind. "You're not dancing?" "No." "Why not?" It was a remarkably direct question for a ballroom, where everything was usually wrapped in 3 layers of politeness before being delivered. Cecilia found, to her surprise, that she preferred it. "Because no one has asked me," she said, with equal directness, "and because I'm not particularly bothered." Most women in your position would be bothered. Most women in my position haven't read enough books to be comfortable with their own company. She paused. That was perhaps too honest. "I find I prefer it." His gaze moved briefly across the room, to Arabella, spinning in the arms of a very pleased-looking young lord, to her mother, watching like a hawk, and then back to Cecilia. "Your mother," he said, "has been looking at me since I arrived." "My mother has been looking at you since before you arrived. She has been looking at you in the abstract, as a category, for approximately 4 years. There was a beat of silence. And then, startlingly, unexpectedly, the Duke of Ashford laughed. It was a real laugh, not the polished chuckle of a man performing amusement, but something genuine and slightly surprised, as though it had caught him off guard. "You're Miss Voss," he said, "the younger daughter." "The quiet one," she agreed. "That's how I'm generally referred to, the beautiful one and the quiet one." "Which would you prefer to be?" She looked at him steadily. "The interesting one." He looked at her for a moment in a way that made her feel oddly as though she was being seen, really seen, for the first time that evening. "Miss Voss," he said carefully, "I believe you may be exactly that." Lady Voss materialized at Cecilia's elbow with the speed and efficiency of a woman who had spent 20 years preparing for exactly this moment. "Your Grace." She sank into a curtsy that managed to be both deeply deferential and subtly triumphant. "What an honour. I am Lady Voss. I don't believe we've been formally introduced, though I knew your dear mother, God rest her soul. She was a wonderful woman. The late Duchess had such exquisite taste." "Lady Voss." The Duke's voice was perfectly courteous. His expression gave nothing away. "And this?" Lady Voss stepped to one side with the practiced grace of a woman unveiling a masterpiece. "Is my daughter, Miss Arabella Voss." Arabella had appeared as if summoned, slightly breathless from dancing, cheeks flushed to a becoming pink, golden hair catching the candlelight. She was, objectively, extraordinarily beautiful. She curtsied with liquid elegance and smiled the smile that had been known to render grown men temporarily speechless. "Your Grace," she said, her voice warm and musical. The Duke looked at Arabella. Cecilia watched him look at Arabella, the polite, assessing glance of a man who had been looked at and presented to for so many years that he had developed an almost involuntary defense against it, and felt something she could not quite name. "Miss Arabella," he said, perfectly pleasant. Perfectly blank. Lady Voss, who had been watching his face with the laser precision of a woman gambling everything on a single card, saw the blankness and recalibrated instantly. "We are so delighted you've joined us this evening," she said, smoothly redirecting. "The season has been quite dull without you. I don't believe I've seen you since the Hartwick dinner 2 springs ago. You were speaking with my husband, God rest him, about the estate management in the north. He had such admiration for your work in that area." "Your husband was a perceptive man," the Duke said. "I was sorry to hear of his passing." "You are very kind." Lady Voss pressed her hand briefly to her chest in a performance of grief that was genuine enough. She had loved her husband, Cecilia believed, and then let it fall. "We have managed, the girls and I, though of course it has not been easy. A household of women without a man's guidance." She paused, letting this land with all the heavy implications she intended, "is a very vulnerable thing." The Duke said nothing to this. He had turned his head slightly, and Cecilia realized with a small jolt that he was looking at her again. "Miss Voss," he said, "the second Miss Voss, which was her. You were telling me about books." Lady Voss blinked. "Was she?" she said, in the tone of a woman who had planned this entire evening and had not included books anywhere in the plan. "She was." Something in his voice was quietly deliberate. "I find I'd like to continue the conversation. Would you do me the honor of a dance, Miss Voss?" The silence that followed lasted approximately 3 seconds. It felt considerably longer. Cecilia was aware of her mother's stillness, the frozen, disbelieving stillness of a woman who had expected him to ask Arabella and was attempting to process the fact that he had not. She was aware of Arabella's small, perfect frown, quickly smoothed away, but there. She was aware of several nearby guests who had been watching and who were now watching more intently. She said, "I would." She took the Duke's offered hand, and she was very careful not to look at her mother's face as he led her onto the floor. "You've caused a scene," she said quietly as they took their positions. "I generally prefer to," he said, with the tone of a man who had considered this and found it acceptable. "My mother is going to talk about this for the rest of the evening. Very likely. She had quite a different plan for you. I know." He looked down at her as the music began. His hand was warm at her waist. "I found I preferred a different plan." She studied him. "You don't know me at all." "No," he agreed. "But in the last 15 minutes, I found out more about you than I found out about most people in 15 years of social obligation." A pause. "You're forthright. You're observant. You're bored by performance, and you don't bother to hide it. You said 3 things tonight that surprised me, and I'm not easily surprised. That seems like a low bar for interest. It's a higher bar than you might imagine." He turned her smoothly through a step. He danced well. Of course he did. Men of his station were taught almost before they could walk. "What are you reading at present?" She told him. He had read it. They argued about it, quietly, under the music, in the small, private space of the dance, and by the time the set ended, Cecilia Voss was aware of two things simultaneously. The first was that Nathaniel Blackwood, the 8th Duke of Ashford, was the most genuinely interesting man she had spoken to in years. The second was that her mother was going to make her life extremely difficult. She was right about both. The carriage ride home was conducted in a silence so thick it had texture. Arabella sat in her corner, examining the fingers of her gloves with studied indifference. Lady Voss sat very upright, her spine a perfect rigid line, staring at the dark window as the Derbyshire countryside rolled past. Cecilia sat in her corner and waited. She did not have to wait long. "He danced with you twice," Lady Voss said. "Yes." "He did not dance with Arabella at all." "No." A pause, during which the carriage wheels found a rut in the road and everyone lurched slightly. "He sought you out specifically," Lady Voss continued, with the careful tone of a woman reconstructing an account she found personally baffling. "He left the conversation with Arabella. He came to you. He asked you to dance, and then—" her voice tightened almost imperceptibly. "He asked you to dance again." "That is what happened," Cecilia agreed. Lady Voss turned from the window. In the dim carriage light, her face was difficult to read, but Cecilia had spent her entire life learning to read it. "Why?" her mother asked. It was such a plain, direct question that Cecilia felt almost sorry for her. "We were talking," she said, "about books and other things. He seemed to find it, I don't know, different from his usual evenings." "Different," Lady Voss repeated, as though the word were a foreign object she was examining from several angles. "He is a duke, Cecilia. He can be different with anyone he chooses. He chose to be different with you when Arabella was standing 3 feet away." "Mama, I'm not angry." Lady Voss said this in the voice of a woman who was, in fact, quite considerably angry. "I am simply trying to understand. You did nothing to encourage this. You were in a corner. You were not even trying." "I know." "Arabella was dancing. She was visible. She was beautiful," Cecilia said. "Yes, she was. She is. I am aware." The word landed in the carriage like a stone into still water. Arabella's eyes flicked briefly to her sister and then away. "That is not what I was saying," Lady Voss said in a slightly different voice. "It is a little what you were saying." Cecilia kept her own voice very even. She had long practice at this, the art of stating difficult truths calmly, without heat, so that they could not be dismissed as temper. "You have been planning for Arabella to marry well since she was 16. That is not a secret, Mamma. I have known it. Arabella has known it. It is a reasonable plan. She is beautiful and charming, and those are qualities that serve well in a great marriage. I have never objected to it." "Then what," Lady Voss said carefully, "are you doing?" Cecilia looked at her mother. "I was talking to someone who wanted to talk to me. I don't know what happens next. I don't know if anything happens next, but I am not going to pretend I was not there." Another silence. The carriage rolled on through the dark. "He will call," Lady Voss said finally, in the tone of a general revising strategy. "Whatever his reasons, a duke does not dance with a woman twice without meaning to call. When he does—" she paused. "We will see." Cecilia nodded. She did not say, "I hope he calls." She did not say, "I have been to 40 evenings like tonight, and I have never, not once, had a conversation that felt like that." She folded her hands in her lap and looked out the window and said nothing at all. But in the dark of the carriage, where no one could see her face, she allowed herself, briefly, carefully, to feel something that might have been hope. He called the next morning. He called at 10 o'clock, which was somewhat early for a morning call and entirely contrary to the conventions of polite society, which suggested 11:30 as the earliest acceptable hour. Lady Voss was still in her dressing gown when his card was brought up. She appeared in the drawing room 12 minutes later, looking remarkably composed for a woman who had just dressed herself in record time, and found the Duke of Ashford sitting in the chair nearest the window, deep in conversation with her younger daughter about the agricultural reforms being debated in Parliament. "Your Grace," she said. He stood, impeccably. "Lady Voss, forgive the early hour." "Not at all." She settled herself on the settee with the air of a queen taking her throne, and the conversation, which had been flowing freely between Cecilia and the Duke, became something more careful and triangulated. He stayed for 45 minutes. He came back the following Tuesday, and the Tuesday after that. By the third visit, even Lady Voss, who had spent considerable mental energy exploring the possibility that this was all some elaborate misunderstanding, was forced to accept the evidence before her. The Duke of Ashford was not calling to see Arabella. He was calling to see Cecilia. Society, predictably, had a great deal to say about it. The story spread through Derbyshire drawing rooms with the speed and enthusiasm of a scandal, which, in the minds of many who heard it, it very nearly was. The Duke of Ashford, reclusive, impenetrable, the most eligible bachelor in the north of England, had danced twice with the younger Voss girl. Not the beautiful one, the quiet one. The one who was perfectly acceptable, but hardly what one would expect a duke to choose. The theories were numerous and varied. He was doing it to make someone jealous. He had a peculiar fascination with plain women. He had lost a wager. He was simply being contrary, as very powerful men sometimes were, simply because they could be contrary without consequence. None of these theories allowed for the possibility that he might have a reason. Cecilia heard most of them second-hand, through the particular social intelligence network that connected the drawing rooms of Derbyshire like an elaborate web. A word here, a raised eyebrow there, a comment passed by her mother's friend, Mrs. Alderton, with an expression of great delicacy that meant she was about to say something unkind. "I am sure it is nothing to worry about," Mrs. Alderton said to Lady Voss, at a morning call Cecilia was technically present for, but socially invisible at, as usual. Men of his position often have these diversions, temporary interests. It will pass, I imagine, before anyone needs to become alarmed. Lady Voss's smile did not waver. "How reassuring," she said, in a tone that reassured no one. Cecilia turned a page of the book she was reading and said nothing. She had become, in recent years, very good at being in a room and not being of it, at existing in the periphery of conversations, heard but not quite seen, present but not quite included. It had begun as a defense, she thought, and had become a skill. She watched and she listened, and she learned more than anyone imagined, because no one was careful with what they said in front of the quiet daughter. What she heard in the weeks that followed the autumn ball was instructive. The younger set thought it romantic. There was always a subset of young women who found the idea of an unexpected choice appealing. The notion that beauty was not the only currency that mattered. A few of them told her so, with varying degrees of tact, at subsequent social events. Their mothers, overwhelmingly, thought it peculiar. Arabella, who had never in her life been anything other than the first choice, was navigating the adjustment with a grace that Cecilia privately found more admirable than she expected. She had not been cruel, She had not been petty. She had simply recalibrated with the elegant efficiency that characterized everything she did, and directed her considerable charms at other prospects. She had also, on a quiet evening at home, knocked on Cecilia's bedroom door and sat down on the end of the bed and said without preamble, "He really does prefer you, doesn't he?" It was not quite a question. "I don't know," Cecilia said honestly. "He looks at you," Arabella said. Not the way men usually look. Not like you're something to be assessed." She was quiet for a moment, picking at the seam of her glove. "He listens to you." "Arabella, I'm not upset." She looked up, and Cecilia was startled to see that she meant it. It's strange. I thought I would be. I've been the one men looked at my whole life, and I thought, if one of them ever didn't. But it turns out it doesn't feel the way I expected." "How does it feel?" Arabella considered this. "Interesting," she said finally. "Like maybe there are things that matter that I haven't been paying attention to." She stood. "Don't ruin it, Cece. I'll try not to." After her sister left, Cecilia sat in the quiet of her room and thought about what Arabella had said. "He listens to you." It was, she thought, perhaps the truest and most remarkable thing anyone had said to her in years. She found out about the first engagement from Mrs. Pemberton, who was constitutionally incapable of leaving a story untold. "Of course you know about Miss Wentworth," Mrs. Pemberton said at a small card party in November, dealing out hands with the practiced ease of a woman who could gossip and count trumps simultaneously. Cecilia arranged her cards. "I'm not sure I do." Eleanor Wentworth. Oh, it was quite the story. This was, 7 or 8 years ago now, before his father died, when he was still Lord Nathaniel. She was the daughter of Baron Wentworth, beautiful girl, absolutely lovely, and everyone said they were perfectly matched. Very much in love, or so it seemed. Mrs. Pemberton paused for effect. She died. A fever. The summer before they were to be married. He was with her at the end, they say, held her hand. The whole thing was terribly sad. Cecilia said nothing. He didn't attend a single social event for 2 years afterward, Mrs. Pemberton continued. And when he finally reappeared, he was different. Harder, some said. Others said colder. He's never shown a particular interest in any woman since, not in the years I've been observing. Another significant pause. Until recently. The card party ended. Cecilia went home and sat in the library for a long time, thinking. She was not, she told herself, drawing conclusions. She was simply thinking. She thought about a young man who had loved someone and lost her, and the 8 years that had followed. She thought about what it would do to a person, to hold someone's hand while they died, to carry that, to rebuild yourself around the absence of what you thought your life would be. She thought about the evenings she had spent in his company over the past weeks, and the things he had said, the careful, measured way he sometimes spoke, as though each word had been considered before release. The way he laughed, still slightly surprised, as though he had not expected to. She thought about the grey eyes that looked at her and seemed, improbably, to see something worth looking at. When he called the following Tuesday, she was in the garden, cutting the last of the autumn roses. He found her there, the butler having apparently directed him with the comfortable efficiency of a man who had come to know the Duke's patterns, and stood at the garden gate for a moment before she heard the latch. She looked up. He was in riding clothes, which meant he had come straight from his morning ride, which meant he had not planned this call, but made it anyway. She noted this without showing that she noted it. "Miss Voss," he said. "Your Grace," she straightened. "The drawing room is warmer." "I know," he came through the gate. "I didn't want the drawing room." They walked among the rose beds for a while in a silence that was, by now, comfortable. They had discovered early that they could share silence without discomfort, which was, Cecilia thought, rarer than most people appreciated. "Someone told you about Eleanor," he said finally. She didn't ask how he knew. "Mrs. Pemberton, of course." He was quiet for a step or two. "I would have told you myself eventually. I want you to know that." "I believe you. I want—" He stopped. They had reached the far end of the garden, where the old stone wall was covered in the last skeletal remains of climbing roses, brown and stripped by October. He looked at the wall rather than at her. "I have been trying for some weeks now to determine how to say what I want to say to you. I find I can't do it with any particular elegance, so I'm going to simply say it." Cecilia held very still. "I have not been interested in anyone," he said, "in 8 years. I thought for a considerable time that I was simply not capable of it anymore, that something had closed. I made my peace with it, or I believed I had." He turned then and looked at her directly, with the full force of those clear grey eyes. "I stood in a corner at Whitmore Hall in October and wanted to be anywhere else on earth. And then you said something to me, and I thought, oh, there it is," Cecilia breathed. "I'm not asking you anything today," he said. "I want to be clear about that. I don't want you to feel any pressure, or to feel that I am rushing something that should not be rushed. I simply wanted you to know what my intentions are, what this has been for me." A pause. "What you are to me." The garden was very quiet. A late bird called somewhere in the elms. "What am I?" she asked very softly. He looked at her for a long moment. "Remarkable," he said. "Simply and entirely remarkable." Cecilia looked down at the roses in her hands. She thought, "I have been the quiet one my whole life, and I am standing in a garden in November being called remarkable by a duke who came to find me rather than sit in the drawing room. And I am not entirely sure this is real." She thought, "It feels real." She said, "You should know that I am not easy, Your Grace. I have opinions. I will share them. I argue about things that matter and some things that don't. I am not biddable, and I am told that is a significant flaw." "I know," he said. "I'm counting on it." And this time, when he laughed, it didn't surprise him at all. The letter arrived in December. Cecilia was in the library when her mother brought it in, holding it with the particular careful grip of a person carrying something they believe might detonate. "It's from Ashford," Lady Voss said. Cecilia looked up from her book. The letter was brief, formal, and in the Duke's precise handwriting, which she had seen on one previous occasion when he had sent a book she had mentioned wanting to read, with a note tucked inside. This was different from that note. He was requesting, the letter said, the honour of a private interview with Lady Voss at her earliest convenience. The matter he wished to discuss was one of considerable importance to him, and he hoped that she would grant him this meeting. Lady Voss read it twice, then she sat down. Then she looked at Cecilia with an expression that Cecilia could not quite classify. It was too complicated, containing too many things at once, some of which she suspected her mother had not yet sorted herself. "He's going to ask," Lady Voss said. "I believe so," Cecilia agreed. "For you." "Yes, Mamma." The silence stretched. "I had a plan," Lady Voss said finally. Not accusatory, simply stating a fact, the way one might state that it was raining. "I had a very clear plan. Arabella would make a great match, and you would make a comfortable one. A good man, respectable family, adequate income. I had plans for both of you, and they were sensible plans, and they were the plans I have built the last 5 years around. I know, Cecilia said gently. And now a duke wants to marry you. Lady Voss pressed her fingers briefly to her temple. A duke wants to marry the daughter I was planning a comfortable life for, and he is doing it because he walked into a room and found you more interesting than your sister. And that is... She paused. That is something I genuinely did not anticipate. Mama. Cecilia crossed the room and sat beside her mother on the settee. Are you all right? I am reorganizing, Lady Voss said with dignity. Give me a moment. Cecilia gave her the moment. He's a good man? Her mother asked finally. You believe that? Not just his position, not just what he can offer, but the man himself? I believe he is, Cecilia said. I believe he is careful and private and has been hurt, and that he chooses his trust very deliberately. I believe he has chosen it with me, for reasons I'm still understanding, and I believe that matters. She paused. I also believe he will make me argue for everything, and that suits me perfectly. Lady Voss looked at her younger daughter for a long moment. All right, she said. All right? I'll receive him. She stood, smoothing her skirts with the composure of a woman recollecting herself. I will receive him, and I will hear what he has to say, and then we shall see. She moved toward the door and then paused. Cecilia? Mama? Your father, Lady Voss said, not quite looking at her, used to say that you were the interesting one. He said it to me privately when Arabella wasn't there to hear. He said the world would catch up to you eventually. A pause. I think perhaps it has. She left. Cecilia sat for a long time in the quiet library, with the letter in her hands, and the winter light coming thin and pale through the windows, and thought that she was very glad suddenly that she had not stayed home from the autumn ball. The Duke of Ashford arrived for his interview with Lady Voss on the 17th of December. He arrived punctually, which Lady Voss noted with approval. He was dressed impeccably, which was to be expected but was appreciated. He accepted the chair she indicated, declined tea, and waited with the composed patience of a man who had learned that impatience was a luxury he could not afford. Cecilia was not in the room. This had been agreed upon without anyone quite saying so. She had made herself scarce in the upper floors of the house, nominally reading, actually finding it very difficult to concentrate on anything at all. Below her, the interview proceeded. She did not hear most of it. The house was old and the floors were thick. But she heard the low murmur of voices, the cadence of a serious conversation, and once, unexpectedly, the brief sound of her mother's quiet laughter, which was not a sound she had expected. It lasted 40 minutes. Then she heard footsteps on the stairs. Her mother opened the library door and stood in the doorway with an expression on her face that Cecilia had no name for, complicated and layered and not entirely steady. He would like to speak with you, Lady Voss said. And? Cecilia asked. A pause. He told me, Lady Voss said slowly, that he had been going to the Pemberton ball with no intention of anyone. That he had spent 3 years after Eleanor died convincing himself that he was managing perfectly well on his own, and that he had grown comfortable with the managing, which he now recognizes was a mistake. She paused. He told me that he was standing in a corner, holding wine he did not want, and looking at a room full of people performing for each other. and that you were the only person in the room who seemed to find the performance as transparently unnecessary as he did. Another pause. He said you looked at him and told him the same thing he had been thinking, and that in 32 years of social life,
no one had ever done that before.
Cecilia said nothing. He told me, Lady Voss continued very quietly, that your father would have approved of him. He said he hoped that counted for something. The silence in the room was very complete. Cecilia stood. I'll go speak with him. He was waiting in the drawing room, standing near the window he always chose, she had noticed, the one that looked out over the street, and he turned when she came in. They looked at each other for a moment. He told her about Papa, Cecilia said. He came up in the conversation. That was, she said carefully, either very calculated or very sincere. I could tell you which it was, he said, but I imagine you already know. She did. She had known it from his face the moment she walked in, the slight tension around his jaw that meant he had been waiting and had not found the waiting comfortable, the careful stillness of a man holding himself composed over something that mattered more than he usually allowed things to matter. She crossed the room to the window. Ask me, she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then the Duke of Ashford, who had spent 32 years being perfectly composed, took a breath that was not entirely steady and asked. She said yes. She did not say it prettily or with any of the demure hesitation that the occasion was supposed to require. She said it the way she said everything, directly, clearly, without ornamentation, and watched the careful, controlled mask of him slip, briefly and entirely, into something that looked like relief and wonder and happiness all at once. Good, he said, when he had gathered himself. That's good. You look, she said, as though you expected me to say something else. The possibility had occurred to me. Why? You know I'm forthright. I don't do things by degrees. No, he agreed. You don't. And he was smiling. Really smiling, without any of the careful calculation that usually accompanied his expressions. And she thought, yes, this is the one. This is the conversation I have been waiting to have my whole life. She reached up and straightened the lapel of his coat, which didn't need straightening, and he caught her hand and held it. Outside the window, December snow had begun to fall, very softly, on the quiet Derbyshire street. The engagement was announced in January. The reaction was predictable in some ways and less predictable in others. The predictable part was that everyone had an opinion, expressed at varying volumes and with varying degrees of tact. Lady Hartwig, who had a daughter of marriageable age and had been nursing ambitions about the Duke for some time, pronounced it very peculiar and wondered aloud whether there was perhaps some financial arrangement she was not aware of. Mrs. Pemberton, who had been the one to tell Cecilia about Eleanor Wentworth, immediately claimed to have seen this coming from the evening of the autumn ball, which Cecilia was almost entirely certain was not true. Lord Pemberton said he thought it a very fine thing, which was nice of him. The less predictable part was Sir Edmund Farrell. Cecilia had not thought about Edmund Farrell in some years, and she had certainly not thought about him in the context of her engagement. He was a baronet, young, good-looking, possessing a modest estate in the next county, and he had courted her briefly 2 winters ago, in the vague and uncommitted way of a man who has not quite made up his mind. Nothing had come of it. He had eventually transferred his attentions elsewhere with the mild, apologetic energy of a man who felt guilty but not enough to behave differently. Cecilia had been briefly stung and then practical about it, and had more or less forgotten him. He appeared at a dinner party in mid-January with a new fierceness in his eyes that she did not remember and did not like. "Miss Voss," he said, cornering her between the dinner table and the sideboard with the slightly too intense manner of a man who had been drinking steadily since 6 o'clock. "Or I suppose I should say, Your Grace to be. Congratulations." "Sir Edmund," she said evenly. "Ashford," he said. "Quite a step up." Something in his voice was not quite right. "I wonder sometimes how these things happen." A man looks away for a moment and... He snapped his fingers. "Gone. I'm not sure I understand you." 2 years ago," he said, I thought we had an understanding." Cecilia looked at him steadily. "We did not have an understanding. You paid some attention and then you stopped. Those are not the same thing. I had complications, financial matters. I needed time to resolve. Sir Edmund." Her voice was gentle, but absolutely final. 2 years is not time. 2 years is a decision. You made yours. I have made mine." She moved to step past him. "I hope you find what you're looking for." He caught her arm. It was not a violent grip. He was not a violent man. But it was too firm, too sudden, too much. And in the doorway of the dining room, where several other guests were beginning to drift in from the hall, it was visible. She had exactly enough time to feel the first spike of cold fury before a voice behind her said, with dangerous quietness, "I suggest you remove your hand." Edmund Farrell's face went through several expressions in rapid succession. He looked from Cecilia to the Duke of Ashford, who had appeared at her shoulder with the absolute stillness of a man who was very angry and very controlled, and removed his hand. "Your Grace," he said. His voice had gone entirely different. "Good evening," the Duke said. His tone was the temperature of a January morning, civil, perfectly composed, utterly without warmth. He offered Cecilia his arm. "Miss Voss, I believe our hosts are ready to receive." She took his arm. They walked away. Behind them, she heard the very quiet sound of Edmund Farrell's carefully controlled exhale. "You didn't have to do that," she said, when they were clear of the doorway. "I know. I was managing." "Perfectly," he agreed. "But I wanted to." He looked at her briefly, and she saw the edge of it still in his eyes. The controlled anger, the protectiveness, the thing underneath that was something she recognized now as the way he felt about her. "Are you all right?" "Yes," she paused. "Thank you." "Don't mention it." They entered the dining room, and seated across from them, Cecilia saw the face of a woman she had not expected to see. A woman she had seen only in portraits, but whose face she recognized instantly, because it was a face that looked at her with the cold, measuring calculation of someone who had not yet decided whether she was a threat. Lady Constance Blackwood, the Duke's sister, had arrived in Derbyshire without warning, and was looking at Cecilia Voss with very sharp eyes. Lady Constance Blackwood was 4 years older than her brother, infinitely more sociable, and possessed of a tongue that cut like good Sheffield steel. She was also, Cecilia would come to discover, the person who loved Nathaniel Blackwood most fiercely in the world, and therefore the person most determined to ensure that anyone who proposed to make him happy was genuinely capable of doing so. They were introduced after dinner. "Miss Voss," Constance said, shaking her hand with the decisive grip of a woman who decided things quickly and committed to them absolutely. "My brother has said almost nothing about you, which, for Nathaniel, means he is entirely serious and cannot bring himself to speak about it without revealing more than he intends." Cecilia blinked. "He told me you were forthright," Constance continued, and that you argued with him about agricultural reform on the third occasion he called on you. He told you that? He tells me everything, eventually. Usually when I pester him sufficiently. She tilted her head, examining Cecilia with direct, assessing eyes. I came to look at you. I see, Cecilia said. And what do you think, now that you have? Constance was quiet for a moment. Then, unexpectedly, she smiled. A real smile, not the performed social variety, something warm and a little sharp at the edges. I think, she said, that you asked me that question when most women would have said something diplomatic, which means Nathaniel is right about you. She paused. I should tell you, I have not liked any of the women who have considered him since Eleanor died. I thought they were after his title, or his estate, or the social position that comes with it. I told him so, and he said I was being unnecessarily suspicious, and I said someone had to be. Another pause. I looked at you across that dinner table tonight, and I watched you watch him. And then I watched him watch you when he thought no one was looking. Cecilia felt something in her chest that she could not quite name. And, she said, very quietly. And he looks at you, Constance said simply, the way he used to look when he was 23 and believed that things could be good. Cecilia absorbed this. I will not make him unhappy, she said. No, Constance agreed. I don't believe you will. She tucked her hand into Cecilia's arm with the easy warmth of a woman who had made up her mind. Come, tell me about the agricultural reform argument. I want to know who was right. They were married on the 5th of April in the old parish church in the village nearest to Ashford House, on a morning that had threatened rain since before dawn, and then, at the precise moment Cecilia stepped out of the carriage, turned clear and pale gold. Lady Voss cried. She had claimed she would not, had said so several times in the preceding weeks with great firmness, and was wrong. Arabella stood as witness, in pale blue silk, and looked at her sister with an expression that Cecilia would not forget. Something proud and warm, and more complex than Arabella's face usually permitted itself to be. The church was small and old, and full of flowers that Constance had arranged with ruthless precision, and that smelled, when Cecilia walked through the door, of narcissus and early spring. She walked alone. There was no one to give her away. Her father had been dead for 3 years, and she had decided, simply and without drama, that this was fitting. She had made this choice herself. She would arrive at it herself. She came down the aisle, and the Duke turned to look at her. Later, she would not be able to precisely describe what passed across his face in that moment. She would try, sometimes, to find the words for it, in letters to Arabella, in her private journals, in the quiet of evenings when she was trying to capture things before they faded. The best she could do was, he looked as though something he had not let himself hope for had arrived. The ceremony was brief and proper and entirely ordinary on its surface. They made the vows that all people made. The vicar spoke words that had been spoken 10,000 times before. But when the Duke took her hand, Cecilia felt the slight tremor in his fingers, quickly controlled, almost imperceptible, and understood that beneath all of his considerable composure, he was not composed at all. She held his hand more firmly. He breathed. They were married. They walked out of the church into the April sunshine, with all the bells ringing, and Lady Voss managing her tears with a handkerchief, and Arabella laughing, and Constance standing at the church door looking at her brother with the contented expression of a woman whose work is done. And the Duke of Ashford stopped on the church steps in front of everyone and looked at his new wife with an expression so entirely unguarded that several of the assembled guests were seen to look away, as though they had witnessed something too private for public viewing. "Well," he said. "Well," she agreed. "The rest of our lives. The rest of our lives." She straightened his cravat, which didn't need straightening. She had acquired the habit, and he caught her hand as he always did. "I have," he said, with careful deliberateness, "been in that corner at every social engagement for 3 years, waiting for the evening to end. I had become very good at waiting for evenings to end." "I know," she said. "I was in the same corner." "And now?" She looked at him, at the grey eyes that saw her, the careful face that was not careful with her anymore, the man who had laughed in surprised delight in a ballroom and not stopped since. "Now," she said, "we have somewhere to be." She took his arm, and the quiet daughter and the reclusive duke walked together into the spring morning and were, at last and entirely, home. Ashford House in spring was a different creature than it had been in winter. Cecilia had arrived in winter, the first week of November, after a honeymoon spent in the Lake District, walking through rain and arguing about poetry, and finding, to their mutual satisfaction, that they were even better together in isolation than they had been in company. She had come to Ashford House when the grounds were brown and bare, and the great old house had the slightly held breath quality of a place that had been too quiet for too long. By April, things had changed. The gardens were laid out with new attention. The library, which was magnificent but had been neglected, the books dusty and unsorted, had been reorganized over the course of 3 months of deeply enjoyable work. Cecilia on a ladder, and the Duke reading titles aloud, and both of them getting distracted by individual volumes for significant stretches of time. The house had been opened up. Windows that had been kept shuttered were unshuttered. Rooms that had been kept closed were opened. Constance had come to stay for 6 weeks in February and had declared, loudly and with great satisfaction, that the house smelled different now. That it smelled lived in, which was a thing it had not been for some time. She was not wrong. Lady Voss visited in March. She walked through the rooms with the careful, slightly dazed expression of a woman reconciling what she had planned with what had actually happened. And at the end of the tour, in the long gallery, with the afternoon light coming golden through the tall windows, she took Cecilia's hands and said simply, "Your father knew." "I know," Cecilia said. "He said, when you were 8 years old, he said, that one will make her own world." I thought he was simply being sentimental. She squeezed Cecilia's hands. He was right. Arabella, meanwhile, had made her own news. Lord Whitfield, young, kind, genuinely devoted to her, in the quiet way that Cecilia recognized, had made his intentions known in February, and Arabella, who had done considerable thinking in the preceding months about what she actually wanted rather than what she had been preparing for, had said yes. The engagement was announced in April. Their mother was, by all reports, managing her happiness with only moderate composure. On a Tuesday evening in late April, Cecilia sat in the window seat of the library at Ashford House, with a book open in her lap and the last of the evening light coming low across the grounds, and listened to the house settling around her, the familiar creaks and sighs of old stone, the distant sound of the kitchen below, the footsteps she recognized in the corridor before the door opened. Nathaniel came in and stopped when he saw her in the window seat. He did this sometimes, stopped in the doorway and simply looked at her, with an expression she had come to know and never tired of seeing. It was the expression of a man who had spent a long time not expecting things and had been proven wrong. "You're home early?" she said. Pemberton's meeting ended ahead of schedule. He crossed the room and dropped into the chair nearest her window. "What are you reading?" She told him. He had an opinion. She disagreed with the opinion. They argued about it for 45 minutes, pleasurably and without resolution, and then had dinner, and then sat together in the library in the comfortable silence of people who have found in each other the thing they had been looking for in every crowded room. Outside, the Derbyshire Spring moved on, and in the corner of a ballroom that had not yet happened, somewhere in the future, some other quiet person was waiting to be seen, waiting to be pointed at, across a room full of beautiful people and performed expectations, by someone who looked past all of it and chose them. That is, in the end, the only story that matters. The one where someone chooses you and you choose them back.